evening, one and all. Greetings, denizens of the interwebs. How are we all? Good to see the chat filling up already. Chanty, Beats and Types, Presto Mechanic TV, Dreadeye and Julie. Good, good. Now remember, if you're new to this channel, and quite a few people have been watching this week, so a lot of you are new. You just need to be subscribed to be able to chat, and it's quite a friendly chat room. There's no nastiness in it, not yet. There's no waiting time either. Once you've subscribed, that's it. There's no cost, no waiting time. You can chat straight away, and we welcome it. We've had people from all over. We had an interesting chat the other day from a chap in Argentina, telling us about how his country's getting done. Hello, Shalini and Vaughn. Good to see you guys as well. So, right. We shall crack on, and remember, as always, if you feel the need, you can always send a donation to ko-fi.com/Sergeant Grumpy. That's SGT Grumpy, all one word. You can also join the channel from as little as 99p a month, I think it is, or you can do super chats. And you know, depending on how the chat's going, super chats will get precedence certainly over regular chat, but it's not a big deal. We don't like to leave you out too long. Right. Frankfurt School tonight. Yeah, we're digging into quite a lot tonight. So let's settle in, because we are diving deep tonight into something that's been gnawing away at me for quite a while actually, and we've touched on it already in the last couple of weeks. So we're going deep, and this isn't your typical trust me bro conspiracy theory. This isn't a mere bagatelle of a rabbit hole, you know. This is a full forensic investigation. Well, okay, it's my idea of one, into how the very institutions that built Western civilization have been systematically captured, infiltrated, and turned against the people they're supposed to serve. So it is quite deep. I'll try and keep it lighter than last night's. Last night's got quite ranty, but it had to be said. I think it had to be said. Right, as you know, I've seen institutions and how they work from the inside. I've worked for the police, I've worked for the local council, I've worked for a university, I've worked for the oil and gas industry, I've worked for multinational media corporations in California. That sounds fucking ridiculous. How did I pack all this in? But yeah, I've been around a while, and I've done a lot and seen a lot. And I've seen how institutions work from the inside, and how they can be corrupted, and how good intentions can be twisted into something completely different. And tonight I'm applying that same investigative approach to a much bigger crime scene: the capture of our universities, the capture of our media, our corporations, our government agencies by ideologies that are fundamentally hostile to Western values. Now, before anyone starts saying conspiracy theory, yeah, everything I'm about to present is sourced, documented, and verifiable. We're not talking about shadowy cabals meeting in smoke-filled rooms. We're talking about a deliberate, methodical, and remarkably successful campaign that's been operating in plain sight for decades. And remember, if you ever need to verify anything or look at anything, do your own research. By all means, rely on my sources as a starter, but don't let that be exhaustive to you. And if you go to sergeantgrumpy.com, you'll find the full reports are up there as a kind of backup to the videos. They usually go up the day after. So, remember those in the vertical chat, you can join in as well. You just need to be a subscriber. There's no waiting period. And we're happy to see you. It'd be good to know where people are watching from tonight. We've got any people from out with the UK, It seems to be at the moment our audience, our top 5 audience, I think, is UK, USA, Canada, Germany, and South Africa. So there you go. Quite interesting. Quite a spread. Because South Africa's quite handy because it's on the same timeline, isn't it? Beats and tapes. He's from South Wales, as always. Yeah. There you go. Right. Anyway, the institutions of the West, our universities, our media organisations, our major corporations, even government departments have been systematically captured by progressive ideologies that are not just different from traditional Western values, but actively hostile to them. This isn't about normal political disagreement. This is about fundamental incompatibilities. So think about it from a police officer's perspective. When you investigate a crime, you look for 3 things: means, motive, and opportunity. Well, in this case, we've got all 3 in spades. The motive is ideological transformation, replacing Western liberal democracy with something that looks more like authoritarian socialism, just dressed up in a nicer language about diversity and equity. The opportunity came from our own success. Western societies became so prosperous and free that we got complacent. We assumed our institutions would always serve our interests because they always had before. And the means? That's where tonight's investigation really begins, because this transformation didn't happen by accident. It was planned, it was funded, and it was executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Now, I know some of you are thinking, this sounds a bit much. Surely it's not that coordinated. And usually I'm the one to say these things aren't, but you have a fair point. This is what all those years in the police taught me. Sometimes what looks like a conspiracy is actually just a convergence of interest. You don't need a grand plan when you've got thousands of people who share the same goals, use the same playbook, and get their fundings from the same sources. So where did this all start? Well, let's settle back and I'll tell you a story, because we're going back to the 1920s. 1920s Germany, in a little place called the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. Ah, the Frankfurt School. Understanding this history is crucial to understanding how we got where we are today. The Frankfurt School, founded in 1923, was where a group of Marxist intellectuals realised that traditional economic Marxism wasn't working in Western countries. Workers in places like Britain, America, Germany, they weren't rising up against capitalism. They were embracing it. They were too busy becoming middle class, buying their own homes and nice cars. So these intellectuals, led by people like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse, came up with something they called critical theory. Now, don't let the academic name fool you. This wasn't just ivory tower theorising. This was warfare by another means. Critical theory took Marx's class struggle concept and expanded it to every aspect of Western culture. Instead of just workers versus capitalists, suddenly everything became about oppressor versus oppressed. Is this starting to sound familiar? Men versus women, white versus non-white, straight versus gay, traditional versus progressive, Christian versus secular. The genius, and I use that term grudgingly, was that they realised they could destroy a civilization by attacking its culture, its values, its institutions, rather than just its economy. They called it cultural Marxism. And unlike economic Marxism, this actually worked. Herbert Marcuse, who ended up in California in the 1960s, put it perfectly when he talked about repressive tolerance. The idea was that Western societies were too tolerant. They allowed opposing viewpoints to exist. True liberation, according to Marcuse, required being intolerant of intolerant ideas. And guess who got to decide what was intolerant? So when you're investigating organised crime, you look for patterns of behaviour. Patterns of behaviour that get repeated across different operations, across different locations, across different cities, across different times. The Frankfurt School created a pattern, a playbook, that's been followed ever since. Anyone heard about critical theory before? Have you encountered any of this stuff in your education, in the workplace? Anyone ever mentioned it? Cultural Marxism? Diversity training? They use terms like unconscious bias, systemic oppression. Heard of those? They've been bandied around in your workplace? These concepts trace directly back to what we are actually discussing at the moment. Cellini, yeah, we've all heard them. Some more than others. The long march through the institutions. That's right. So we've established the theoretical foundation. Now let's talk about the implementation. The Frankfurt School intellectuals didn't just want to critique Western civilization. They wanted to replace it. And they had a strategy for doing that. Exactly that. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, had written about the need for a long march through the institutions. The idea was simple. Instead of violent revolution, you gradually take control of the cultural institutions that shape how people think. Schools, universities, media, entertainment, even churches. And this is where it gets really interesting from an investigative standpoint, because what we're seeing today isn't the result of some secret conspiracy. The result of a very public, very well documented strategy that's been playing out for decades. And I mean, we've mentioned this before on the show. When Ben and I did Chasing Dissent, we mentioned that Ben was always a great fan of the long march through the institutions. And let's start with those institutions, the universities, because that's where it all began. And the evidence here is pretty much overwhelming. The National Association of Scholars documented how elite universities now function as incubators of leftist ideology. We're not talking about a slight liberal bias, which, to be fair, most universities have always had. We're talking about complete ideological capture. In many departments, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, you literally cannot find a single conservative professor. And it's not just about hiring, it's about what's being taught. Critical race theory, gender studies, post-colonial theory. These aren't academic disciplines in any traditional sense. They're actually activist training programs designed to produce graduates who see Western civilization as fundamentally oppressive and in need of radical transformation. And here's the kicker. These graduates don't stay in academia. They go into journalism, corporate HR, government agencies, NGOs, political parties. They take their ideological training with them and start implementing it wherever they land. And I mean, I used to notice this because when we used to hire people in the old days, you had an interview with a couple of the people who were interested in the person was going to be working for them. And then HR needs to get involved. And then HR tells you things you can't say. Like how are you going to get to work if you live in Dundee and you're interviewing for a job in Glasgow? Are you going to move? Well, you can't ask them that. You can't pry into their personal life. And it's like, oh, there's no point in offering a job that someone is going to try and commute from Dundee. So let's talk about what this looks like in practice. Speech codes on a campus that prohibit anything deemed offensive. Does that seem familiar? And somehow it always seems to be conservative viewpoints that are those that are deemed offensive. Mandatory diversity training that treats traditional Western values as inherently racist or sexist. Cancel culture that destroys anyone who dares to question the new orthodoxy. There's specific examples here. Professor Bruce Gilley at Portland State University had a peer-reviewed academic article retracted after activists threatened violence. Professor Kathleen Stock was forced out of the University of Sussex for questioning gender ideology. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a systematic pattern of intimidation designed to enforce ideological conformity. But universities are just the beginning. The same pattern has been repeated in media organisations, where journalists now openly admit they see themselves as activists rather than neutral reporters. And that's a point, because why is Rebel News funding Tommy Robinson? News organisations shouldn't be funding anyone, should they? In corporations where environmental, social and governance mandates force companies to adopt progressive political positions, regardless of what their shareholders or customers want. And we'll come back to ESG. Oh, excuse me. So, nobody in the vertical, nobody chatting, nobody wanting to say anything. Any of you guys get any issues so far? You with me? Are you still with me? Are you hanging in there? It's a long week, isn't it? This is only Wednesday. Tommy Robinson calls himself a journalist. Maybe that's why the media are bankrolling. Do you really think he's a journalist? He's not a journalist, is he? He's an activist. I could call myself a journalist. I think I'm more appropriately a journalist than Tommy Robinson is. I'm not an activist. I'm pointing out facts. I'm taking both sides. I'm on record as saying I think that there's a place for some left ideas and right ideas, and there's a place in the middle for them. And if you go either way, you're pushing too far. So no, I have to disagree with you, Espresso, or I have to disagree with the people that call Tommy Robinson a journalist, because he's not. He's an activist. He's quite simply an activist, and he makes it perfectly clear. We're live, says Shalini. I think you mean we are. So there should have been an apostrophe in there, but I'm not going to pull you up for it, even though I just have. You know I'm kidding. Right. So we've established that this transformation is real, and it is systematic. I hope we have. And now comes a question every good detective asks. Who's paying for it? Because, make no mistake, this kind of institutional change doesn't happen without massive funding. We are talking about billions of pounds being spent to reshape Western society according to progressive ideology. And let's start with our old friend and biggest player on the planet, George Soros and the Open Society Foundation's network. Yay! Yay, George! Now, I know mentioning Soros gets some people worked up, but we're going to stick to documented facts here. Since 1979, Soros has distributed over £25 billion through his various foundations. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's a documented financial fact, public record. His Open Society Policy Centre alone donated £110 million to advocacy groups in 2021. These organisations then work to influence everything from criminal justice policy to immigration law to voting procedures. They are working behind the scenes, in plain sight. And perfectly documented. And Soros is not working alone. He's not the only one out there. The Ford Foundation spends over $400 million annually on what it calls social justice causes. The Rockefeller Foundation has been funding progressive causes since the early 20th century. These aren't charities, not in any traditional sense. They're political organisations designed to reshape society according to their donors' vision. So when you're investigating money laundering or organised crime, you learn to follow the money through multiple layers of organisation. The same thing's happening here, and we talked about this, was it last night or the night before? It's all interwoven. It's like a spider's web. Money flows from wealthy donors to major foundations, then to smaller advocacy groups, then to universities, media organisations and political campaigns. By the time it reaches its final destination, it's almost impossible to track it back to its original source. Take the Black Lives Matter organisation, and just from a point of order, talking about the organisation, not the sentiment. I'm not going to go into that. Investigations revealed that BLM received over $60 million in funding. Much of it from corporations and foundations with ties to the Soros network. That money then got distributed to local activist groups and used to influence elections and policy decisions. Buy houses, of course. Bought a few houses. Look at the network of climate activist organisations. They're all interconnected. Look at Dale Vince and his connections. Look at Roger Hallam, where he was getting his money from. They're all interconnected. They're sharing funding sources, their personnel and their strategies. That's not a conspiracy. That's a business model. It's not all just American money. We've got the World Economic Forum promoting its Great Reset agenda, essentially calling for global governance by unelected technocrats. The UN's Agenda 2030 creates international frameworks that constrain domestic policy choices. Even China's getting in on the act. They have their Confucius Institutes influencing Western universities. None of these groups ever start at grassroots level, says Espresso Mechanic. They're all started by corporations and all the state. Yeah, of course they are. Or wealthy individuals. Soros has kicked off quite a lot of them. Soros has had his hand in a few, shall we say, less than clean political deals, particularly if you start digging into the history around certain European nations around about 2014. Now we come to the most controversial part of the investigation, perhaps, the role of mass migration in this institutional transformation. And I want to be very clear here. We're going to discuss this based on evidence and data, not emotion or prejudice. The numbers just don't lie. According to Pew Research, Europe's Muslim population will grow from 4.9% in 2016 to somewhere between 7.4 and 14% by 2050. That depends on migration levels. Even under a zero migration scenario, the Muslim population will nearly double due to higher birth rates. Now, it's not inherently a problem. People do have the right to practice their religion and live where they choose. The problem is how our captured institutions have responded to this demographic change. And we've been through this in quite detail, but we'll go there again. So instead of focusing on integration and assimilation, helping newcomers adopt Western values like individual liberty, gender equality, and secular governments. If you remember back in the 60s and 70s, we had a lot of people coming over from Jamaica, and they did become part of Britain. But our institutions have embraced multiculturalism today. The idea that all cultures are equally valid, some maybe more than others, and that expecting integration is somehow racist or oppressive. And you know the stats. And from experience, I can tell you, this approach is an absolute disaster. I've seen firsthand how parallel societies develop when there's no expectation of integration. Communities that operate by different rules, different values, different loyalties. Just look at the traveller community. They are complete law unto themselves. They don't pay even lip service to any of our laws in the country. They do what they like. That's just one tiny small community. When you get a completely different culture in Hamilton cities as large as Bradford and some of Birmingham and London, then you're going to have completely different societies. And that's been seen by them setting up Sharia law court, which is a complete anathema to the rule of law and order in this country. We should not be standing for this at all. Communities that operate by different rules, different values, different loyalties, doesn't work. It's not integration. Multiculturalism does not work. The stats prove it. Academic research, and I'm talking peer-reviewed studies, not opinion pieces, shows significant challenges with Muslim integration across multiple dimensions. Higher rates of poverty, segregation, and social alienation compared to other immigrant groups because they stick to themselves. I know this firsthand. My daughter has a friend who is a Muslim, and ever since the age of 9, when the Imam started coming round, she's gone completely weird. More concerning, surveys consistently show that significant minorities within Muslim communities hold views that are fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracy. That's not conservative democracy, that's liberal democracy. So we're talking about attitudes towards women's rights, homosexuality, free speech and religious liberty that have been considered medieval in the West. But we put up with them now. Why? We are regressing our culture. So instead of addressing these integration challenges honestly, our captured institutions have made criticism of these attitudes practically illegal. How long before blasphemy laws are actually brought in? And this is where you've got to give Tommy Robinson his due. He's calling out these things. But when you try talking about things like honour killings, forced marriages, FGM, and you'll be accused of Islamophobia. Point out that some communities have vastly higher rates of certain crimes, and you'll be called racist. Suggest that maybe, just maybe, unlimited immigration from incompatible cultures might cause social problems, and you'll be deplatformed faster than you can say, diversity is our strength. Because all the research and all the statistics tell us that diversity is not a strength. And yet, when you point out that 46% of the prison population is composed of something like 7% of the general population, it's got to be an issue there somewhere. But no, you're Islamophobic. And this is where the institutional capture becomes really dangerous, because when institutions refuse to acknowledge reality, they create the conditions for social breakdown. People can see what's happening with their own eyes, but they're told by every authority figure that they're imagining it, or that noticing it makes them bigoted. It's coming with a new definition of Islamophobia, says Shalini. Won't be able to talk about grooming gangs, immigration, crime, etc. And if you censor speech, there's a reason for it, isn't there? It's like those people that say things like, if you can't see the problem, you are the problem. That, to me, has been bastardized to the point where it's now used as a put down, meaning you're thick and I can't be bothered arguing with you because I actually don't have an argument. That's kind of what I get from the people that say that, because they can't argue with you because they can't formulate a cogent argument that goes against what you're saying. I think it's a cheap, lazy way of trying to stop a conversation. So, we've talked about the ideology, the institutions, the funding, and the practical consequences. Let's discuss how this whole system maintains itself, the enforcement mechanisms that keep people in line. And this is fascinating because it does operate a bit like a protection racket, just with social and professional consequences instead of physical violence. It's all good, clean fun. First, you've got the legal framework, hate speech laws that are selectively enforced against anyone who challenges progressive orthodoxy. Anti-discrimination regulations that have been weaponized to punish wrongthink. ESG mandates that force corporations to adopt progressive positions regardless of their shareholders' wishes. But the real enforcement happens through what we call cancel culture. And it's not really an organic phenomenon, it's a systematic campaign of intimidation designed to silence dissent. So here's how it works. Someone expresses a view that contradicts progressive orthodoxy. Within hours, social media mobs are demanding their firing, deplatforming, social ostracism. Employers, terrified of being associated with controversy, perish the thought, immediately distance themselves. The person loses their job, their platform, their social connections. And we've seen this happen very recently over the last few days to people that have said horrible things about Charlie Kirk. And that doesn't make it right. Because, yeah, these people are stupid. And they're paying consequences. But the same thing happens on the other way around more often than it is this way now. If that makes sense. The beauty of this system, again, you have to use the term grudgingly, is that it's self-reinforcing. After a few high-profile examples, most people learn to self-censor. Self-censor, don't they? We don't say certain words on this platform. We say grape. That was a good grape last night. 3 people were involved in that grape. Yeah. That's the kind of infantile system that we've got running now, isn't it? That we can't use proper adult words and can't have proper adult conversations, even when you're only talking to 6 people. Because people know that expressing certain views will destroy their life, so they keep quiet. And I've seen it personally. I've seen it happen in the police. And as police officers, you know certain statistics are true, but you can't say them publicly because you'll be accused of racism. Black people commit more crime per capita than white people in the UK. Prove me wrong. It's a statistic. It's a verifiable statistic, and it's proven by government documentation until they stopped collecting the stats. Teachers who disagree with gender ideology stay silent because they need their jobs, apart from that chap in Ireland who has got balls off steel. I think he's had a €200,000 fine, and he's still turning up and telling them they're wrong, and he's right. Journalists see their bias in their own newsrooms but go along with it because speaking up means career suicide. And it does. It does. It's crazy. People don't appreciate being told the truth. People like to be sheep. They like to be herded. They just like to go with the flow, anything for a quiet life. And that's a British flaw. We need to stand up more often, and we need to speak out. And we're going to have to learn to have to do that if we want to keep this green and pleasant land. And it's not just individuals, it's entire institutions practice anticipatory obedience. They implement progressive policies, not because they believe in them, but because they're afraid of being targeted by activists. The result is a culture of fear that would make any authoritarian regime proud. People are afraid to speak honestly about what they see happening in their own communities, their own institutions, their own countries. Here's the thing. Systems based on fear and intimidation are inherently unstable. They work for a while, yes, and they can work very effectively, as we have seen. But eventually, the contradictions become too obvious. The consequences become too severe. And people start pushing back. Now, some of you might be thinking, yeah, this sounds all very theoretical, but how exactly do they force corporations to adopt these progressive policies? You know, shareholders elect boards, boards hire CEOs, surely market forces would prevent this ideological capture. Well, that is a fair point. But again, it works like a protection racket. Yeah, Shanti, I think that's been the case for a lot of social media platforms, to be fair. Let me introduce you to the most brilliant control mechanism ever devised. ESG. environmental, social, and governance scoring. And before anyone says, oh, that's just the corporate virtue signalling, no, it is not. It bloody well is not. ESG is a sophisticated financial control system that bypasses democratic processes entirely. What it really measures is ideological compliance. Companies get scored on how well they adopt progressive positions on climate change, diversity quotas, social justice initiatives, and governance structures that prioritise stakeholders over shareholders. In 25 countries, including most of the EU, ESG is now mandatory. Not voluntary, mandatory, not optional, legally required. The EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive affects over 50,000 companies. That's not a fringe movement. That's not investors and people. That's institutional control on a massive scale. And here's how it works. When the mob run a protection racket, they don't threaten every business. They don't go around and beat up every business owner directly, do they? They pick one or two. Word gets around. If you don't pay up, bad things will happen to you and your business. ESG works exactly the same way. Companies with low ESG scores face higher borrowing costs from banks or even not being lent to in the first place. Divestment from pension funds and institutional investors. Regulatory scrutiny and investigations. Public shaming campaigns led by activist groups. And difficulty obtaining insurance or business contracts. It's nice business you have there. Shame if something happened to your ESG rating. And this is where it gets really good, isn't it? Because you know what's coming next, don't you? Who runs this particular protection racket? Well, we've got three main groups. We've got the ESG rating agencies, companies like MSCI, Sustainalytics, and, yes, you knew it, our old friends at BlackRock. These organisations control over £100 trillion in assets globally. They don't just rate companies, they vote the shares of the companies in their funds. So they effectively control corporate policy for massive chunks of the economy while generating billions in fees for ESG compliance consulting. Progressive NGOs and activist groups, companies pay them directly or fund their causes to avoid being targeted. That's a protection racket. It's literally paying protection money to avoid being attacked by the same people that set the ESG standard. And thirdly, government bureaucrats who get to implement progressive policies like Ursula von der Leyen without going through messy democratic processes like elections, because she's not elected, she's appointed, or parliamentary votes. ESG mandates let them control corporate behaviour through regulatory pressure rather than legislation. We do live amongst a lot of evil people, Shalini, you're quite correct. And that's an even better one. Psychos are running things. Right. Can we get this off? Thank you. Okay, now this is where ESG reveals itself as a pure ideological capture. The environmental scores heavily weight climate activism over actual environmental protections. The social scores reward diversity quotas and social justice initiatives while penalising companies that focus on merit-based hiring. The governance scores punish traditional business practices and reward stakeholder capitalism, which is just socialism with a fancy name. A company can have an excellent environmental record. They can treat its workers well and deliver strong returns to the shareholders. But if it doesn't mouth the right progressive slogans or hire according to demographic quotas, it gets hammered in ESG scores. And remember, one of the few ones that's had to go against ESG was Netflix, because ESG was running Netflix into the ground because of all the woke shit it was producing. And they have knocked it back. I'm not sure that they've cured it, but they have knocked it back. It isn't a theoretical future system either. It's operational right now and has been for at least a decade. Major banks won't lend to certain industries based on their ESG scores. Insurance companies are denying coverage. Government contracts are being awarded based on ESG compliance rather than value for money. We're talking about a parallel regulatory system that operates completely outside democratic control. Unelected bureaucrats at rating agencies and NGOs are effectively setting economic policy for entire nations. What's brilliant about this system is how it corrupts the very concept of fiduciary duty. Corporate executives are legally required to maximise shareholder value. But ESG forces them to prioritise progressive political goals instead. When companies lose money pursuing ESG mandates, executives can claim they had no choice. Regulatory pressure made them do it. Big Boy did it and ran away. The perfect system for implementing unpopular policies while avoiding democratic accountability. Brings us full circle to our investigation. Remember those billions flowing from progressive foundations? Much of that money funds the NGOs that pressure companies on ESG scores. Remember the captured universities producing ideologically trained graduates? They're the ones working at ESG rating agencies and corporate sustainability departments. ESG isn't separate from institutional capture. It's the enforcement mechanism that makes everything else possible. It's how progressive ideology gets implemented in practice, even when it's unpopular with customers, shareholders, and voters. Without ESG, companies could ignore the woke messaging and focus on business. With ESG, they have no choice but to comply or face financial destruction. It's institutional capture, and with teeth. So next time, if anyone tells you ESG is just about being environmentally responsible, show them this analysis, show them other analysis. It's not about saving the planet. It's about controlling the economy through ideological compliance. And that's exactly what organised crime looks like when it goes legitimate. Right, we are getting to the end, people. We are, trust me. Maybe if they hadn't been, we wouldn't have had the leaders we have now. Well, that's true. Espresso, it did start in kind of started before 2020. It's been a lunatic asylum since then. I think that made it worse, but ESG was creeping around, 2018, 2019, maybe even before that. So, after the deep dive into how our institutions have been captured, you might be feeling pretty depressed. I need something more upbeat, don't I? Tomorrow night's going to be better. We're having a celebration tomorrow night. Celebration of things that are great in Great Britain. And I get it. The scale of this transformation is genuinely staggering. But here's the thing, recognising the problem is the first step towards solving it. And there are signs of resistance. Legal challenges to the most egregious examples of institutional overreach. Alternative institutions being built by people who refuse to accept the new orthodoxy. Political movements gaining ground by speaking honestly about these issues. University of Sussex was fined £585,000 for suppressing free speech. That's not much money to a university, but it's a signal that courts are starting to push back. Similar cases across the West suggest growing judicial recognition of the threat posed by ideological conformity. The problem is how long before those ESG graduates get into the position of the judges. We are seeing alternative media organisation, independent researchers and new educational institutions that refuse to bow to progressive orthodoxy. They're smaller than the established institutions, but they're growing and they're proving that alternatives are possible. Most importantly, we're seeing popular resistance. Elections across the West where ordinary people are rejecting parties and policies that prioritise progressive ideology over practical governance. Brexit, Trump, populist movements across Europe, these aren't accidents. They're reactions to institutional capture. The one way the people know how to push back. But, and this is crucial, political victories alone won't fix this problem. The institutional capture runs too deep. We need sustained effort across multiple domains, legal challenges, alternative institution building, cultural resistance, and yes, we need political change. We need to break away from these stupid 2-3 party systems. We need people that are representative of the population, that represent your wishes, not just people that want to be there because they want the power. And you know what they say? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. The key is accountability. These institutions, universities, media organisations, corporations, government agencies need to be held accountable to the people that they're supposed to serve, not to the progressive activists who've captured them. And that means transparency about funding sources, hiring practices and decision-making processes. It means legal consequences for institutions that violate their own stated principles or their legal obligations. It means withdrawing support, financial, social, political, from institutions that have turned against us. Most importantly, it means having the courage to speak honestly about what we're seeing, despite the social and professional risks. Because the alternative, allowing this transformation to continue unchallenged, is far worse than any personal consequences we might face. Oh. I feel I've aged so much this last week. Oh dear. I hope that's not just been. I hope that's not been me. But yeah, it's been quite a hard week so far for me. My auntie died today. My mum's youngest sister. That's a shame. My wee Auntie Nancy. So the question is whether we'll have the courage to speak the truth before the damage becomes irreversible. Because make no mistake, this is about the survival of Western civilization itself. Not just our prosperity or our politics, but our fundamental values, our way of life, our children's future. The institutions that our ancestors built to serve us have been turned against us, but institutions are just, when it comes down to it, collections of people. And people can change. System can be reformed. Or if necessary, it can be replaced. But that's going to require all of us, ordinary people who still believe in truth, freedom, and accountability, to stop being passive observers and start being active participants in defending our civilization and defending our values. Everything is on the line for us, Shalini. You're 100% correct. So thanks for joining me on this investigation tonight. Keep asking questions, keep demanding answers, keep speaking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people feel. Ooh. And as always, it's been great for you